So how do we record transactions with shipping terms? And what are these shipping terms that we have to take note if we are recording merchandising transaction? So the important consideration in recording transactions with shipping terms is to determine who are the owner of the goods, or who is the owner of the goods while in transit, and who is responsible to pay for the shipping fee or the delivery cost, and who actually paid the shipping fee to the common carrier. So those are the accounting considerations that would affect the journal entries. So if there is no agreement as to who will bear the shipping cost of the items delivered, so the buyer shall be liable for such. So the buyer ang mubayad if there's no agreement. Usually that is the case if you try to order online, 'di ba? From Shopee, Lazada, and even ka ng mga food delivery services, 'di ba? The buyer is the one who pays for the freight. So the liability for shipping or transportation costs can also be agreed by the buyer and the seller. There are also times when the seller would offer the free shipping, 'di ba? Or free delivery. So, pwede ra pod gihapon. So, as a rule, the owner of the goods should bear the freight costs of the goods being shipped. And now, the question would be, who is the owner of the goods that are going to be delivered? So, the terms FOB shipping point and FOB destination identify who owns the goods while in transit, because the owner of the goods while in transit should be the one who will pay for the freight or the transportation costs. So we have the terms FOB shipping point and FOB destination. So FOB stands for free on board. So free on board shipping point. So this means that goods are placed free on board the carrier by the seller, and the buyer must pay the freight cost. So this term also means that the ownership of the goods is transferred from the seller to the buyer from the moment the goods departs from the seller's place, which is the shipping point. So this means that the term FOB shipping point tells us at what point there is already a transfer of ownership. And sa term na FOB shipping point, when we say shipping point, so from the time it is shipped from the point of shipping, okay, there's already a transfer of ownership. And from asa gikan o nya padung ni man ang transfer sa ownership, so gikan sa seller padung sa buyer. So the buyer is the owner of the goods in transit in FOB shipping point. And as I have mentioned a while ago, whoever is the owner of the goods while in transit should also be the one to pay for the freight charges. And remember, in our inventory accounting, the freight charge is added to the cost of the inventory. So, ma-add na siya. That's why in the perpetual inventory method, every time there's a freight in nga recording sa periodic nga side, we convert that to inventory or merchandise inventory in the perpetual system. So when the buyer is liable for the freight, he records the freight cost as freight in So, pag si buyer ang responsible for the freight, dapat freight in or transportation in. So, in ang iyahang term. So, the freight charges are usually prepaid by the seller and added to the invoice. Buyer adds the shipping costs to the inventory. But if the seller will prepay, so bayaran daan ni seller, so the seller has a receivable from the buyer, meaning paulian niya sa buyer. So i-add niya sa iyahang tilngonon gikan sa buyer. If it is FOB destination, so the term is destination, the transfer of ownership will happen in the point of destination. So once the goods arrived to the buyer's place or buyer's destination. So therefore, while in transit, okay, ay pa man ma-transfer ang ownership to the buyer when it reaches when the goods reach the buyer. So therefore, samtang nagbiyahe or while in transit, the seller is still the owner of the goods. Therefore, who should shoulder the transportation cost if in transit pa siya? So the one who is responsible for the freight charge while in transit is the seller because the seller is still the owner of the goods. Therefore, if the seller is the one who is responsible for the freight charge, the buyer will not make any entry for the freight charge. Instead, ang seller ang mag-record sa pamliti or mag-record sa freight. So how does the seller record the freight? So the seller will record the freight as freight out. So pag kita ang namaligya, out ang term. Or you can call it as transportation out, but that's longer than the freight out nga term. Or simply delivery expense because naturally, that's a delivery cost, di ba? Pag ipadaan mo sa imuhang buyer, so this is a delivery fee. But you shouldered, as the seller, you shouldered the delivery, so delivery expense. And if we're talking about who paid the who made the actual payment for the freight cost, so it will depend on the following terms: freight collect, freight prepaid. So if it's a freight collect, the agreement would be the buyer will be the one to pay for the freight. If it's freight prepaid, this means that the seller already paid the freight. But it doesn't mean nga whoever paid the freight actual nga payment, whoever made the actual payment of the freight is also the one responsible for the freight cost. It's not the case. Okay? So, dili na siya automatic nga kung gisay ni bayad sa common carrier, siya jud ang responsible for the plate. Because, pwede nga, i-accommodate ra ni seller si buyer, that's why yahang gibayaran daan, pero ang agreement is FOB shipping point. So, kung FOB shipping point, di ba, si buyer naman ang tag-iya. So, si buyer dapat amo bayad sa PT. So, since gibayaran man daan ni seller, pero dili man si seller ang owner sa goods while in transit, iyahang i-add tong pliti sa iyahang tilngonon ni buyer. So, pwede na siya. We have this transaction on the buyer and the seller side. So, the instruction here would be we need to prepare the entries on the side of the buyer and the side of the seller. Okay, so for the first item, okay, so we have purchase merchandise on account. And then on the side of the seller, of course, the seller sold the merchandise on account. So these are 4 different cases. So combination of the FOB shipping point, destination, freight collect, and freight prepaid. So for the FOB shipping point, Then freight collect, so we have the following. So the purchases made by the buyer, so that's purchases 100,000 and credit accounts payable. And accordingly, we have the freight paid here is 10,000. So since this is a shipping point, the buyer is the owner of the goods while in transit. So therefore, the buyer should be the one to record the freight charge. That's why there's a freight in and credit cash. On the side of the seller will just simply record the sale. The second transaction is return merchandise to the seller. So accounts payable, credit purchase returns. On the side of the seller, sales returns, accounts receivable. Then the third one, we have paid merchandise within the discount period, and letter D is paid beyond, so without discount. So the term there is 2/10. So there's a 2% discount if paid within 10 days. So if there's a discount, so the discount will be based on the purchases, okay? So how much would be our net purchase here? So we have 100,000, the original amount. However, there's a return of 15,000. So ang nahamili na lang, 'di ba? Nga iyahang bayro nun. So if we trace the accounts payable, so that's 100 minus 15, and that would be 85. So 85 ang accounts payable that we need to close if we're going to pay it in full. However, since there is a discount, because within the discount period man ang payment, so therefore, there's a 2% discount. Okay? So the 2% discount is based on 85,000. So 85,000 times 2% is 1,700. And the remaining amount, or the net amount after we deduct the discount, would be the cash payment. So credit cash. On the side of the seller, so kung nag-credit o cash si buyer, nag-debit o cash si seller. So debit cash, 83,300. And kung nag-credit o purchase discount si buyer, si seller mag-record og sales discounts. Then, credit, accounts receivable, mauna ang partner sa accounts payable ni buyer. So, opposite yun na sila. Pero same amounts. If ever the buyer did not pay within the discount period, so there's no discount, so just simply close the accounts payable ng 85,000 and credit cash. And on the side of the seller, debit cash, credit, accounts receivable. Let's go to case B, shipping point but prepaid. So what does this mean? The owner of the goods while in transit is the buyer, but the seller already paid the freight. But this would be a little nga problem because, di ba, the one responsible for the freight here is the buyer, di ba? Siya dapat ang mobayad sa pliti. But the seller already paid for the freight. So how do we account and make adjustments? So first is, again, we record the purchase. So we have purchases, credit accounts payable. On the side of the seller, that's accounts receivable, credit sales. Remember that the buyer is the owner of the goods while in transit. So, padayon gihapon nga mag-debit of freight in and then credit accounts payable. Nganong accounts payable man siya, ma'am? Nganong dili man siya cash? Diba dili cash ang gibutang? Okay. Cash ang gibutang diri because the buyer is the one who paid for the freight. But here, the buyer is not the one who actually paid for the freight, but the seller. So therefore, since gibayaran man ni seller ang pliti in behalf of the buyer, so naay additional nga bayro nun si buyer ngadto ni seller for the pliti. On the side of the seller, since siya may nibayad sa freight, so siya ang mag-credit og cash, di ba? Kaya siya may nibayad. And then, dili man siya pwede mag-record of freight in because dili man siya ang responsible for the freight, di ba? Because the owner of the goods here is the buyer. So therefore, instead of recording a freight charge, accounts receivable iyahang i-debit. This means that naa siya additional nga receivable from the buyer in the form of freight. So ang total receivable niya 110,000. If there's return, so again, the same accounts payable, credit purchase returns, and on the side of the seller, sales returns, credit accounts payable. Now, in settling the payment within the discount period, so how much is the balance in the accounts payable nga account? So, accounts payable, 100 nga credit, credit 10,000, so that's 110. And we have the reduction because of the returns. So you have 95,000. So 95,000 ang accounts payable. But how much is our purchase discount? Is it based on the 95,000? So the answer is no, because the 95,000 includes the freight. We do not discount the freight because if we multiply the 2% against 95,000, this means that included in the discount ang freight, which is not the case. Wala may discount ang freight. Unsa naman ang na-discount? The only amount that would be discounted would be the net nga purchases or the remaining accounts payable. So only the accounts payable for the purchases will be used as base for the discount. So only 85,000. Diba? 95 man to, minus 10, so 85. So katulad gihapong purchases, net purchases. So you have 1,700 because 2% times 85%. We deduct this from 95,000. So the amount to be paid is 93,300. On the side of the seller, so debit cash for the amount received, sales discounts 1,700 and credit accounts receivable. Okay? For the for the payment without the discount, so debit accounts payable, credit cash, so still 95,000. There's no deduction for discount kay beyond naman the discount period. So 95,000 ang payment, and that would also be the amount to be received by the seller. So debit cash 95,000, credit accounts receivable. Let's go to the next case, FOB destination freight prepaid. So who is the owner of the goods while in transit here? That would be the seller. And who paid for the freight? Accordingly, this is freight prepaid, so seller. If this is the case, nga si seller ang responsible for the freight and si seller sad ang ni bayad actual sa freight, there would be no problem. Walay mga reimbursement or wala dili ulian, okay? So wala siya problem in the recording. So again, purchases, credit accounts payable on the side of the buyer, and then credit debit accounts receivable and credit sales on the side of the seller. But remember, since the seller is the one responsible for the freight because it is FOB destination, the seller would be the one to record the freight charge. And how does the seller record the freight charge? That would be debit to freight out. So pag seller gani ang nag-record sa freight, dapat out ang term. Then, credit cash. Why do we credit cash? Because the seller actually paid for the freight. How do we know, ma'am, nga na ang seller ang the one who actually paid for the freight? Because the term here is freight prepaid. Gibayaran daan. And kisa may mubayad daan ang seller. If there are returns, the same. Accounts payable, credit purchase returns, then sales returns, credit accounts receivable. Now, what if the buyer pays within the discount period? So, 100 minus 15, so that's 85,000. Then, credit purchase discount, that's based on the remaining nga liability related to purchases. So, that's 1,700. And credit cash, 83,300. The side of the seller, so the seller will receive the cash. So, debit to cash, debit to sales discount, and credit accounts receivable. And then if the buyer did not pay within the discount period, so just simply close the accounts payable account and credit the cash for the payment, and the seller will receive the cash and debit cash and credit accounts receivable. Now for case D, this is destination. So the seller is the owner of the goods while in transit, but the buyer was the one who actually paid for the freight. So what would be the entry? So again, purchases, credit accounts payable, then accounts receivable, credit sales for the seller. And since the buyer is the one who actually paid for the freight, actual nga ni bayad sa common carrier, so si buyer ang mag-credit o cash. But since di man siya ang responsible, the buyer is not responsible here for the freight, but siya lang ang gipabayad sa carrier. So, dili siya mag-record og freight charge. So, instead of recording or debiting a freight charge, so accounts payable ang i-debit. So, debit accounts payable, 10,000. On the side of the seller, since si seller man ang responsible for the freight, so siya jud ang mag-record og freight charge. So, on the side of the seller, it's freight out. And credit accounts receivable. Ano accounts receivable man siya, ma'am? Because supposed to be siya dapat ang mag-credit sa cash kasi siya man 'di ba ang responsible for the freight, because dili man siya ang actual nga nituno sa payment. So na siya bayro nun gikan kay buyer. So na siya bayro nun ni buyer for the freight. And instead nga mo hatag siya og money ni buyer para sa payment or mag-reimburse siya ni buyer, so pwede na natong i-offset sa accounts receivable. So i-charge nato. So makuan ang accounts receivable by the amount of the freight charge. So instead nga mutuno si seller og bayad ni buyer, unya naman po'y bayro nun si buyer ni seller, so kuan na lang ang receivable. The same entry for the returns, debit accounts payable, credit purchase returns. Then we have debit sales returns, credit accounts receivable. Now, if the buyer pays within the discount period, so how much would be the remaining accounts payable? So we have 100 minus 10. So makuan yung bayro nun, kaya naman siya tilngon nun, gikan ni seller, because of the freight nga gibayaran niya, nga dili man unta siya dapat amo bayad kay dili man siya responsible for the freight. So we have remaining would be 90,000, and then we have the returns nga 15, so you have 75,000. The discount is again still based on the net purchase. Katong purchase lang gihapon, walay labo tong sa discount. So, 85,000 gihapon ang basihan, dili ang 75,000. So, 1,007, the remaining amount would be the cash payment of 73,300. On the side of the seller, that's debit cash, debit sales discount, and credit accounts receivable. If the payment is beyond the discount period, so debit accounts payable, credit cash. And then on the side of the, if you like this video, don't forget to click like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to be updated with the latest video lessons. Thank you for watching.